Well, a couple of years ago, I had a unique preaching experience. It was a Saturday night. I was praying before church, and it just seemed like there were certain seats where I would pray in the auditorium. And as I would pray near that seat, I could almost see who was sitting there, and I would just pray a prayer over them. And I would keep praying and keep moving, and the experience just kept happening. I hesitate a lot of times to tell stories like this because it's one of those you either believe it or you don't believe it, and there's no better way to explain it than just tell it as it is, but there's no real proof to it. So you're just sort of left as the listener believing or not believing. But aside from all of that, if I could just keep telling the story and you give me the benefit of the doubt for the moment. And I just went from chair to chair, it seemed like, and it felt like it was endless, though I know it wasn't. And by the time I had finished praying, I knew that those prayers were to be prayed over those saints in the service the next morning. And so I went home, went to bed, woke up, got ready for church. We all came to church. Everybody was all excited about church because you're always excited about church. And on Sunday morning, the worship team, they crushed it, and there was just the presence of the Lord in the house. And I came on stage, and I just began to go pray those prayers. But it was fascinating to me that as I went to the one who was there, that the prayer made such a change, a witness in them, but then I would go to the next place and they weren't there. And the next chair, they weren't there. And the next chair, they weren't there. And the next chair, they were there. And they received those prayers and they were transformed with those prayers. And I moved to the next one and they weren't there. And the next one and they weren't there. And what was fascinating is I walked away from that moment. And it never happened before that moment. It hasn't happened since. Not in that way. But I was forced to know. There are many things that we know, but sometimes we're forced to know. And I was forced to know that there are many times that God has more for us, but we either don't believe it or we do not position ourselves to receive it. And it seems like in this modern variant of Christianity that we miss out on many moments where we could receive from the presence of God, but we just don't seem to lean in and actually do it. We see a similar scenario in the life of Jesus, where he was in a town called Capernaum. And in that place where he was teaching and praying for people, there were many miracles that happened during those prayers. And there was revelation that was preached during those times. And then he left Capernaum and he went to his hometown. He went to Nazareth. And that wasn't what happened in Nazareth. It was a different scenario. And while he preached to them at one time in the temple in his hometown, after reading from the prophet Isaiah, he then said, today, in this moment, this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing. And when he finished that statement, there began to be a culture seen or visible in his hometown that maybe wasn't obvious until that moment. Sometimes we have experiences in God that locate us. We're in a meeting, we're in a conversation, and something is said or something is done, and in a moment, we realize sort of where we are in our journey of faith. Have we progressed or have we not? And this is where they found themselves. So let's just pick up the story here in Luke chapter 4 and verse 22. It says, "And all spoke well of Jesus and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. And they said, 'Is not this Joseph's son?' And he said to them, 'Doubtless, you will quote to me this proverb, Physician, heal yourself. What we have heard you did at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well.' And Jesus said, 'Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. But in truth I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and a great famine came over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. When they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath." Now let's just sort of take this from the top and work our way to the wrath part. At the beginning, they all marveled at him. At the beginning, they were all just wondering about this Jesus. At the beginning, there is no mention of wrath. And that's because in the beginning, it said they marveled at his gracious words. Jesus led in the conversation with words of grace. Now, this would be something for all of us to learn today. Sometimes we hear things in the world that we disagree with. We get in the middle of situations that we're frustrated by. And in that, we just feel like we need to bring correction right then. And yet Jesus led with gracious words. He led with words first that encouraged people. He led with words first that people could receive. The other day at our house, I was complaining or correcting. I'm really not sure which one it was, to be honest with you. But I was having this conversation with one of my kids, and they said, "Dad, I feel like I'm always in trouble." And I realized in that moment that that was on me, because in this chapter of transition, there are a lot of things that are different. So the kids don't go to school and then do work and then come home with their grades. They don't go to school, do a project, and just come back with something. They're there at the house. And there isn't tennis team anymore because it got canceled, and there's not baseball because it got canceled, and the pool is closed. And so in these areas for my household where we have frequent wins, those frequent wins give me as a dad the opportunity to give gracious words to my family, to give encouragement, to give attaboys, to tell them, "Great job, that was awesome." It's different when they take something and it gets graded and they bring it home in their Tuesday folder, and you look through it and it's a bunch of good grades written on top of, or much improvement, or something that you have in your hand that you can celebrate. And in this chapter of transition, I realized that I wasn't looking to where I needed to be looking to give the support or the encouragement where I needed to give it. That because the systems had changed as a dad, I hadn't caught up yet. And all I was seeing were the moments that needed discipline. Or what I was seeing were only the moments that needed me to speak into them. And a lifestyle, a household culture where all there is correction and discipline, there is a sort of tension in the house that's constant. And what I realized was our systems of advancement and excellence had changed. And as a result, I was not giving encouragement. Because when we give gracious words, we build equity in the situation that give us the position where we are able then to speak correction. When there are no gracious words, we're not in a place where we can hear correction. We've made no deposits. And all of a sudden, we want to fix something, but we haven't positioned ourselves. We haven't put ourselves in a relationship with that person to be able to give voice into that space that needs correction. And I know that it's easy to say, well, I'm the parent. I can do what I want to. And maybe that's true, but that doesn't mean that what we want to do will actually be effective. You might have a right to do something, but that doesn't mean that the thing that you have a right to do will actually work. And what I found in that moment of my child being very honest and transparent with me was that I was lacking in gracious words. I wasn't saying the things that I needed to say to build up their confidence so that they would be in a place where they could even hear correction, where they could confidently fix what needed to be fixed so that their life could elevate. And so from that moment, I began looking around. I haven't found a lot yet, but I'm still looking. And we see this with Jesus. He leads in this conversation with gracious words. And with the gracious words, they marveled. We see this lifestyle really throughout the ministry of Jesus. There was a time when a lady was caught in the act of adultery with another man. And the rulers of the day, apparently strange story. I guess they snatched him out of bed or something, and they sent the man away. And then they held the lady there for her judgment. And Jesus came around and they explained the situation. And they said, now what? Now what do you think that we should do? And Jesus, in this moment, he reaches down and he writes something in the ground. And as he did, all of those who were going to judge her who had rocks, because that was the judgment, they were going to stone her. They dropped the rocks and they walked away. And so Jesus looks at her and he says, where are your accusers and what are they saying? And she says, there are none. I have no accusers. And he says, well, then I'm not going to accuse you either. Go. What is that? That was a gracious word. After an act of mercy, where Jesus does not judge her, then in grace he says, go. We see this in another time in Jesus' ministry. There was a pool, and this pool, the idea had been spoken where if the waters would be troubled or just begin to randomly move, that was because an angel had gotten into the pool. And if an angel of healing stepped into the pool, then if you were nearby the pool and you had need of healing, if you would get in the pool first, then you would suddenly be healed. And so here are all these people who have afflictions and all of these people who have ailments, they're around this pool. And Jesus is walking through and he sees a man who's lame and he's on a mat. And Jesus says, do you want to be healed? And the man says, well, yeah, I would like to be healed, but the problem is I don't walk well because I can't get around, and every time the water is troubled, I can't get into the pool before someone else does, so I'm kind of stuck. And so Jesus, in that moment, tells him to stand up, pick up his mat, and walk away. And in that moment, the man is healed. So now, to keep the story going, this man is walking from where he was and he finds himself in the temple. It happens to be the Sabbath, and he's still carrying his mat. And the religious people come up to him, and they're like, hey, you can't carry your mat. It's the Sabbath. And he says, well, that may be true, but the guy that just healed me, I couldn't walk, and now I can. The guy who just healed me told me to carry my mat. So since he told me to walk, and I couldn't, and now I can, it seems like it's a good idea for me to continue in obedience and carry the mat that Jesus told me to carry. Some of us, God has told us something to do. He has given us an instruction, and we did it good for a little while. We were obedient for a season, but we've gotten a little bit slack and lazy in our obedience, and it's time for us to carry our mat, to pick our mat back up that we have been told to carry so that we can live in a place of obedience. So now Jesus sees this man in the temple carrying his mat, and he goes up to him and he says, "Hey, you're healed." And the guy says, "Yeah, this is crazy." And Jesus says, "Go and sin no more, so that something worse doesn't come on you." Now, what was the first thing? That healing was an act of grace. That was a gift of God that he just gave to that man. But what was the next thing? That was a word of truth. When he told the lady caught in adultery, he said, "Go." That wasn't the last thing that he said. He said, "Go and sin no more." We see this in the life of Jesus, where he leads with grace. But after leading with grace, then he brings a further truth. And this is something that in our culture and in our lifestyle, we are beginning to be very uncomfortable with. We're comfortable with the grace part. We're comfortable with the promises. We're comfortable with all the goodness of God. But we're uncomfortable with the truth that calls our lifestyle into question. We are uncomfortable with the truth that forces us to recognize Jesus for who he is and no other. See, in John chapter 1 and verse 14, it says it like this: "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Jesus didn't just lead with gracious words, but he also spoke truth. And we see this in our text. We see this moment where Jesus makes a pivot from grace to truth. They marveled at all of these gracious words, but then they said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" And when they asked that question, what immediately is seen from their hearts is that they do not believe that the prophecy of Isaiah was just fulfilled. What they do not believe is that Jesus is the Son of God. What they believe is that Jesus is the son of Joseph. And when they said Jesus is the son of Joseph, and therefore Jesus is not the Son of God, then he introduced words that went from gracious words to truth words. Because now he said doubtless. Now he said truly. Now he said in truth. He's now shifting from grace to truth so that he can bring them to a place where they have to make a decision. They have to make a decision. And all of us are left with that space when we have a relationship with God where he drops truth into our lap and it forces us to make a decision. Because Jesus could not be the son of Joseph and the Son of God. He could not be. He could not be both of these things. We see this conversation in academic circles. A Scottish theologian by the name of John Duncan in the 1800s, he put this forth as a trilemma. He said Jesus was either deceiving everyone with a great deception, or Jesus himself was deceived, or he was divine. He was deceiving, or he was deceived, or he was divine. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity in 1952 kind of brought it up this way, that it's a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. That same trilemma that must be answered. Jesus is either what he said that he was, or he's nothing. And this idea that we can sometimes carry in our conversations with other people that don't believe, and we affirm their positions that Jesus was just a prophet, or we affirm their position that Jesus was just a teacher, or we affirm their position that Jesus was just a good person. He was none of those things if he was not God. He's Lord or he's none of it. The apologist Ravi Zachariah, he's really battling for his life right now. He's very, very sick. And my my wife's a huge fan, and we were having this conversation yesterday about Dr. Ravi, and she reminded me of this story where he was sitting down with one of actually the largest in terms of audience television preacher on the planet right now. And Ravi and his wife were there with this TV preacher and his wife, and they were having this conversation. And the TV guy, he's just a really nice person, really stays on the gracious words side of the conversation. And in this conversation with Ravi, he says that he has was speaking with someone, a friend who was a Muslim, and it was just amazing how there were so many similarities between the Muslim faith and Christianity. And in that moment, Ravi, who is generally a very, very kind person, said, "Why would you say that? Why would you say that?" And the man just began to give the areas that seemed like they agreed. And Ravi leaned in a little harder and he said, "Do you realize that none of our New Testament do they believe? That the majority of our Old Testament, they do not believe. That they do not believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. That they do not believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That they do not believe that Jesus was crucified on a cross for the remission of sins and that he was buried and that 3 days later he was raised from the dead. They do not believe that. And also, sir, they do not believe that Jesus Christ is coming again for you and me. So where do we have agreement if not the gospel? There's no agreement whatsoever. And this was a moment where in this life of Jesus speaking at his hometown, they did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And when they did not believe that he was the Son of God, he went into this dropping of truth that just frustrated them to the point that they went from marveling at his words to they wanted to throw him over a cliff. And in our conversation with people, we should always lead with grace, but our leading with grace should never stop where we're not willing to give the truth of the fullness of the gospel. We have to. It's our message. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 41, it says that Jesus is explaining this to his disciples. He said, "If you receive a prophet because he is a prophet, you will receive a prophet's reward. And if you receive a righteous person because he is a righteous person, you will receive a righteous person's reward." And then in John chapter 13 and verse 20, he said, "If you receive the person who I send, you receive me. And if you receive me, you receive the one who sent me." And so we see these layers of influence into our lives where when we receive those layers for what they are, I don't receive a righteous person's counsel because it's just a good idea. I receive it because I recognize who they are. If you receive a righteous person because they're a righteous person, you receive a righteous person's reward. If you receive a prophet because they are a prophet, you receive a prophet's reward. Sometimes we don't want to hear truth. Sometimes we don't want to hear what causes us some tension. But if we could understand that God places people in our lives to speak truth from his throne, truth from his word into our lives, and if we will receive it, there is a reward that comes with receiving it. They heard Jesus' words. They marveled at Jesus' words, but they did not receive Jesus' words because they didn't receive Jesus. They said, "He's just the son of Joseph." Like, that's it. When we find ourselves dealing with truth, we then have to be introspective and look at, God, what are you trying to tell me today? Where does transformation need to happen today? One of my biggest fears of this whole last 8 weeks, 9 weeks, whatever it is today, is that in the middle of all of this, when there was chaos around us, that we didn't actually take the time and grow in the places where we could have grown. That we emerge from this chapter to the next no better prepared to live out the next chapter because we have not embraced anything that we could have learned about ourselves in this chapter. You know, we say, I love my spouse. If you're married, I love my husband, I love my wife. But after being around them that much, whew. So what we're really saying is, we love being around our spouse a couple hours a day, but if you go more than that, then no, we can't handle that. Oh, we love our kids as long as they can be at school 8 hours a day, and as long as they can be asleep 12 hours a day, and as long as their grandparents will come get them for an hour a day, and as long as somebody will babysit them for another hour a day, like I can handle dinner with them. But if that's our posture, if that's our truth, then we should change something in our household where we are raising children that we want to be around. And if at the end of this, our only desire is to push them right back out the front door, and what we didn't learn is that we needed to make some adjustments so that we are raising, that we are developing, that we are leading the kind of family that we actually want to lead. If we're not learning that, then we're missing something. If we're not learning how to lift our hands and worship Jesus when it's just Jesus and us, if we have to have the volume, if we have to have the smoke, if we have to have all the lights, then we haven't learned what we needed to learn in this season when everything has just sort of been stripped away. If we don't have contentment in our heart without going from place to place to place and buying and buying and buying and looking and consuming and buying and looking and consuming, if we don't have contentment in our heart, then we haven't learned a thing. And I hope that in this season that we've learned something about ourselves that will allow us to be the better people that God has called us to be. I was having a conversation with a friend via text the other night, and he said, you know, all this hollering about people's rights being taken away, he said, I've never felt so free. And I chuckled at it because it was spoken as a true introvert. Like only in the middle of a quarantine could an introvert say, I've never felt so free. Because there are other people who are not introverted who don't feel free at all. They feel like this is like the worst thing that has ever happened, like ever. And these are the ones, if you don't want to go somewhere with them, they get mad at you. Like they need you to be there because they need you to entertain them. Or they need you to be there because they need you for them to be able to entertain you. Like they have to have people. They have to have the party. They have to have the chaos. They have to have the noise. And when all that's been stripped away, this group of people, they do not feel at all like they're living their best life. And yet this group feels like they're living their best life. And who's right? Neither one of them are wrong. They both feel what they feel. This person over here, to all the introverts in the world, I hope you recognize and you have seen in this that you actually need time every single day to get to yourself so that you can recharge. But I also hope that you don't take that so far that the truth that is within you, the grace that is within you, that you're now content to just hibernate in your room and no longer walk among people and bear fruit out in the community. That you don't feel like it's okay for you to lock yourself away, even though that feels very much like freedom to you. I hope you realize you still have a lot in you that needs to be given out there, and you have to step out of your comfort zone in order to do that. And I hope for you extroverts that feel like it always needs to be noisy and there always needs to be chaos, I hope that in the middle of all of this, you have learned what it means to step back from the noise and get in your closet of prayer where you can find and hear and see vision and hear with ears to hear what the Spirit of the Lord might say to you. I hope all of us have learned that in this stripping away, we can see what it is that is best for us and what it is that isn't. I hope we see in our household what we are really building. I hope we understand the kind of lives that we are actually living. I hope somewhere along the way that truth has been able to penetrate so that God could speak to us and transform us into the image that He desires us to be. Because stepping into the next chapter of life, it is going to take all of us with the fire of God within all of us to make a difference in the community that surrounds us. That means we had to learn something in the middle of all of this. And this is what Jesus was telling his hometown. He said, look, when there was a famine, no one in Israel learned anything. They didn't learn a thing. They didn't get it. They didn't understand it. And so God had to leave his chosen people and step over into a place called Zarephath, where there was a lady, a widow lady, that would hear truth. And when there was the epidemic of leprosy in the land and everybody was having these issues, he didn't heal one of them, but God only stepped out of that land, and he had to go to a Syrian who would believe, who would be healed. And they didn't like this conversation. In the middle of this conversation, what was evident is that Jesus was telling them that he is provider and that he is healer. And it made them angry. It takes us to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. It says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. There in Nazareth, it said Jesus could do no mighty work because of their unbelief. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. For those who would draw near to him must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who seek him. Now, they could understand the rewarder part, but they couldn't understand the he is part, that he is God. They couldn't get that. That he is, and he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Exodus 3:14, when Moses was going to go introduce himself to the people of God, he said, well, who do I tell them that you are? He said, I am that I am. So you go tell my people that I am has sent you. What I love about that description is there is no period. What I love about that description is that God is everything that God chooses to be. And we don't make that decision, God does. He just said, I am. I am what? He is who he is in the middle of our situation, and he'll determine who he will be in that situation. We see this begin with Abraham when he was having this conversation with God, and it didn't look like the promise was going to happen. It didn't look like he was going to have the promised child that God had promised him. And now at 99 years of age, when Abraham's wife Sarah was 90, she was 90 and he was 99. And God said, the two of you are going to have the child of promise, and you're going to have him because I am mighty God. That's that word El Shaddai. In that moment, God said, I am mighty God. I'm not going to give you a child from your concubine. I'm not giving you a child from your wife's servant. I'm giving you a child through your wife. And it looks impossible to you, and it looks like it's never going to happen because you're 99 and she's 90, but it's not happening because of your strength. It's happening because I am mighty God. And then later on, we see where Abraham had that child. God's promise came true. And now he's taking that child because God says, I want you to give him back to me. And so Abraham is going up a mountain to give his child back to God. And he puts him on that altar. And Hebrews tells us that Abraham believed that even if God had to raise him up, that he was going to obey. What I think is beautiful about that is God had told Abraham, I am mighty God. As miracle worker, as more than enough, Abraham believed that even if his child died on that altar, that mighty God would raise him up. He believed in the miracle worker God. He believed. But in the middle middle of that, it wasn't El Shaddai that he saw. Rather, there was a ram that was provided in the thicket. And in the middle of that, what did Abraham say? Yahweh Yireh, you are God, my provider. You didn't show up and raise the dead. Rather, you gave me what would sustain me in the moment. God was saying, I am. I am what? I am miracle worker. I am provider. When we're in the middle of a situation, what we need to listen for is who is God saying that he will be in the middle of our situation. And when we hear who he says he's going to be, we embrace who he says he's going to be so that we see him work a miracle or we see him provide. Leaving the patriarch, now we go to Moses. They had seen mighty God. They'd seen the Red Sea part. They had seen provision. God was feeding them with manna from heaven every single day. But now there was sickness in the camp. And God's people were dying. And then God shows up and begins to heal them. And he tells Moses, if you will follow me and be obedient to me, I will be your healer. Yahweh Rapha, the Lord who heals. They'd seen mighty God. They'd seen God provider. Now they were seeing God who heals. Step from the children of God, and now we're in the period of the judges. Gideon, an unlikely candidate for leadership. He was from a family that was not revered as warriors, and he was the least of his family. And God was calling him to lead a revolution. And Gideon says, I'm like the least person that should be a part of this. There are some of you, God is calling you to lead, and you keep discounting yourself because you're looking at everything on the outside, but you need to be aware of what God has placed on the inside. And that gift of leadership that he's placed inside of you, he's waking up within you so that you will have the confidence to go and be the person that God has called you to be, because you can make a difference in the situation where he's placed you that other people won't make, because he has found in you someone who has a heart after him. And Gideon couldn't believe this. And he was having this anxiety and this frustration. And he's like, I can't be that one. And in that moment, God demonstrated himself as Yahweh Shalom, the God of peace. And that mind, that anxious, frustrated, confused, doubtful mind was suddenly put at peace. And he went on to do what God called him to do. Now we're past the judges into the kings. And David, a shepherd boy turned king, was in a valley of decision. And in that place, direction wasn't obvious. There were a lot of different ways to do this. He says, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, because his rod and his staff, they comfort me. He anoints my head with oil. My cup, it overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The Lord is my shepherd. Yahweh Ra. They had seen God as miracle worker, God as provider, God as healer, God as peace. Now he says, the Lord is my shepherd. I am confident that he will take me where I need to go. I am confident that he will lead my pathway. I am confident that even if I'm walking through the valley of the shadow of death, I'm fearing no evil, because he's just leading me through it, where I'm going back to that mountaintop. I'm going back to that place where I will dwell in his house forever. I'm not going to be in the valley forever. I'm going through the valley, but I'm going where I'm going to dwell in his house forever. And from the valley to his house, goodness and mercy are going to follow me. Now, here's what we have to understand. They had all of those promises. Israel had every single one of those promises when there was famine in Israel. They had every one of them, but they believed none of them. When they saw the prophet, they didn't receive the prophet as a prophet and therefore receive a prophet's reward. When they saw the prophet, what they said was, there is the troubler of Israel. They were no longer willing to embrace truth. They were no longer willing to follow God into a place where they would have sufficiency, where that sufficiency would become abundant. But they had turned their back on him. And in that place, Jesus says, God then looked for somebody. We said it last week, and I just want to remind you this week that God is always looking for faith. He was going from widow's house to widow's house to widow's house all over Israel, and he was looking for faith, and he didn't find any. And he went over here, and he didn't find any. And he went over here, and he didn't find any. I believe God is looking for our worship, and he's looking for our faith. And when he comes by your house, I believe he will find it. When he comes by this house, I believe that he's going to find it. And so now Elijah, the prophet, has left the land of Israel, and he's gone to Zarephath in the land of Sidon. And he sees a widow. He says, hey, will you go make me something to eat? And she says, I would love to, but we don't have enough. I'm just going to make something for myself and my son, and we're just going to die. This is it. It's been a good run. And the prophet said in 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 13, he said, go and do as you have said, but first, make me a little cake and bring it to me. And afterward, go make something for yourself and for your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, your jar of flour shall not be spent, and your jug of oil shall not be empty until the Lord sends rain on the earth. And when he said these words, she went and did as Elijah said. And she and he and her household ate for many days, and the jug of flour was not spent, and neither did the jar of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord. God spoke, and someone believed it. And when they believed it, God did what he promised to do. In that moment, he didn't send rain. He wasn't El Shaddai in that moment. What he said was, this jar and this jug will not run dry. In other words, I'm not here to work a miracle. What I'm here to do is provide. What God is in your house promising for you, are you receiving what God says he will do for you today? Naaman, he was a military leader in Syria. There were lepers all over Israel, but to none of them was God sent. There was a follower of God in his household, a servant, and she felt for her boss. He was a good man. She didn't like that he had this sickness. And she said, I know that there's a prophet. And if you'll just go talk to him, I know my God will hear you. And a man who was a military leader in Syria believed the word of a servant. And he went to Israel, and he goes to the house of Elisha, and he says why he's sent. And Elisha says, if you'll go wash in the river Jordan 7 times, you will be made clean. Now here's where I think we find ourselves a lot of times. He gave him an instruction. He was there in faith. He left his house in faith. He showed up at the house of Elisha in faith. But then when he heard the command, all of the sudden, he began to step back a little bit. all of a sudden his faith began to falter. It wasn't what he thought he was going to hear. Sometimes truth, when it comes, it takes a little bit more to embrace it. It's not always as easy to just say yes. He said, I've got rivers that are cleaner than that river all over my land. Why would I go wash in that nasty river? It didn't make any sense to him. There are things that God tells us in his gospel. Hierarchy, gender roles, leadership positions, budgeting issues. And we think, why does that doesn't even make any sense. Well, we could do it a completely different way. In that moment, we reject truth. Anytime we reject truth, it's the absence of faith. Where there's the absence of faith, it's impossible to please God. It makes no sense to me that I can give God $1 out of 10 and that he'll multiply it. It makes no sense. It makes zero sense to me sometimes when God has called me to lead my household. And I think, I'm not suited to do this. Makes no sense. There are times that the gospel doesn't always make the sense that we want it to make. There are times that the gospel doesn't always seem reasonable. But is it true? Because if it's true, then it is to be obeyed. And so Naaman had to hear this request from the prophet, and he had to believe it, and he was shaky. And then somebody who was with him, remember when you receive a righteous person, because he's a righteous person, you receive a righteous person's reward. Somebody who was with him said, Naaman, look, if he'd have made this difficult, you would have done it. But because it's so easy, you're not wanting to. I just think you should do it. And all of a sudden, a man who was a great military warrior, who probably had a little bit of pride to deal with, had to humble himself to follow the instruction. And he went over to the river Jordan, and in 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 14, it says, and he dipped in the river Jordan 7 times, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was made like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Because if we're going to draw near to him, we must believe that he is who he says he is in the situation where he has shown up. And we must believe that he will reward us if we will diligently seek him. I don't know fully what you need from God today. I don't know what you've struggled with this week. Some of you are sitting there and you're listening and you think it all sounds good, but you don't know the week I just came through. But he does. And in the middle of the week that you just came through, he still gives you his word. And in his word, there is a truth for you today, in this moment, in this hour, that he is asking you to believe, asking you to seek him through so that he can reward you. It's not just truth, it's grace too. There's great reward in following God. We access this great grace by our faith. God has made you a promise. He's promised to be mighty God. He has promised to be your provider. He has promised to be your healer. He has promised to be your shepherd. If we will believe him to be who he said that he is, you will see the fullness of everything that God has for you this